Last night, the official White House account posted 3 words: "They walk among us." It linked to a brand new government website called Aliens.Gov. At the same time, the Department of Homeland Security was pushing the same site with the message, "They don't belong here." And within hours of those posts going live, a federal judge cleared the way for a presidential executive order that critics say could restrict who is allowed to vote by mail in November's midterm elections. 2 fronts. 1 night. And a country that cannot agree on whether either of these moves is protection or a power grab. We are going to break down both of these stories in full: what Aliens.Gov actually is and what it contains, what the mail-in voting executive order says and what a federal judge just decided, what lawmakers on both sides are arguing, and what the combined impact of these 2 moves could mean for the November midterms and for American Democratic participation. This is a story about 2 things happening at once and whether that timing is a coincidence. The sequence of events began taking shape on the evening of May 28. Shortly after 10 p.m. Eastern, the official at POTUS account posted a video with the caption, "They walk among us," and another simply, "Discover the truth." The website, according to posts from at The Hill and at Aliens.Gov, is a White House-launched platform touting immigrant arrest statistics and what the administration describes as the record of its immigration enforcement operations. The launch generated immediate and polarized reactions. According to posts from at Speaker Johnson, House Republicans framed it as evidence that the administration has closed the border and is protecting Americans from what he called criminal illegal aliens. At Senate, GOP echoed the message, stating that ICE and CBP officers risk their lives daily and that Republicans are, in their words, superfunding law enforcement. Meanwhile, on the other side of the aisle, Senator Booker's posts from May 27 described conditions at the Delaney Hall immigration detention facility in New Jersey as a moral stain, noting that the majority of people he encountered had no criminal charges. Simultaneously, and this is where the story doubles, at Reuters reported in the early hours of May 29 that a federal judge had declined to block the president's mail-in voting executive order, at least for now. The Hill confirmed the ruling shortly after 4 a.m., and Senate Minority Leader Schumer had already responded the night before, accusing the administration of rigging elections and warning that a MAGA judge was enabling the effort. Together, these 2 developments, a provocative immigration website and a court-approved voting order, landed within hours of each other. The first question many viewers are asking is what the mail-in voting executive order actually contains and whether a federal judge clearing it means it is constitutional. The short answer is that the court ruling described by at Reuters is a preliminary decision not to block the order. It does not mean the order has been found constitutional. A preliminary ruling of this kind simply means that the challengers have not yet met the legal threshold for an emergency injunction. The underlying constitutional question, whether the president has authority to regulate elections, which Article 1 of the Constitution assigns to Congress, remains unresolved and is almost certainly headed toward further litigation. On that front, Senate Minority Leader Schumer's argument, as shared in his post on May 28, reflects a widely held legal position that Congress, not the executive branch, holds the constitutional authority to regulate federal elections. A second pressing question is what Aliens.Gov represents as a government communication strategy. Some analysts suggest the launch of a dedicated government website using the term aliens alongside cinematic language like "They walk among us" represents a deliberate departure from neutral administrative communication into political branding. The Senate GOP framing that Republicans are superfunding law enforcement without a single Democrat vote reinforces a midterm electoral message that appears coordinated with the website launch. This may suggest that what looks like 2 separate stories, an immigration campaign and a voting order, are parts of a single pre-midterm strategy designed to animate the Republican base while placing Democrats in a defensive position on both border security and election integrity simultaneously. Does the judge's decision mean the mail-in voting executive order is constitutional? No, a preliminary ruling declining to block an order is not a constitutional endorsement. It means challengers have not met the bar for an emergency injunction. The underlying constitutional question over whether the president can regulate federal elections remains unresolved and is expected to continue through the courts. Is the Aliens.Gov launch a government information campaign or a political messaging operation ahead of the midterms? the coordinated rollout across at POTUS and at Aliens.Gov, the cinematic language, and the timing alongside a court win on voting rules may indicate a deliberate pre-midterm communications strategy rather than a neutral public information initiative, though the administration would likely frame it as straightforward enforcement transparency. In New Jersey, the human dimension of the immigration enforcement story is most visceral. Senator Booker's post from May 27 described conditions at Delaney Hall, a private, for-profit detention facility, as a moral assault, noting that most detainees he encountered had no criminal history and many had deep ties to American communities. For New Jersey residents, the facility represents a frontline collision between federal immigration policy and local identity. Moving south to Florida, the dual story lands differently. With hurricane season approaching, Senator Rick Scott posted preparedness guidance from Ponte Vedra Beach on May 28. Florida's large immigrant population, particularly in agricultural and coastal communities, is watching both the enforcement rhetoric of Aliens.Gov and the voting order with particular intensity. Any restrictions on mail-in voting would disproportionately affect communities where in-person voting access has historically been uneven. In Texas, the mail-in voting order intersects directly with what Forbes reported as a heating Senate race between Ken Paxton and James Tallarico, a contest described as threatening to upend the entire midterm map for both parties. Changes to voting procedures in a battleground state of this scale could have direct implications for turnout models and electoral outcomes. Finally, across major American cities with large immigrant communities from Chicago to Los Angeles to New York, local officials and advocacy organizations are already responding to the Aliens.Gov launch with counter-messaging, raising concerns about how the site's framing may affect community trust in law enforcement and willingness to cooperate with local authorities. The administration and its congressional allies have a substantive case to make on both fronts. On immigration, at Speaker Johnson and its Senate GOP both argued this week that the border is safer than it has been in years, that ICE and CBP officers are doing essential work protecting Americans, and that Democrats' opposition to enforcement funding amounts to prioritizing, in Johnson's words, criminal illegal aliens over Americans. On the Aliens.Gov site specifically, supporters would argue that publishing arrest data and enforcement statistics is simply government transparency, making publicly available the outcomes of a mandate the administration was elected to carry out. On mail-in voting, the strongest opposing argument is that the executive order is a legitimate exercise of National Election Security Authority, that ensuring voters are who they say they are serves the integrity of the democratic process that both parties claim to support. At Senate, GOP noted this week that their position is one of superfunding law enforcement, not restricting rights. The unanswered question hanging over all of this is whether the constitutional challenge to the mail-in voting order will reach a final ruling before November, because if it does not, the order may shape an election before the courts ever decide whether it was legal. Tell us in the comments, do you think Aliens.Gov is a transparency tool or a political campaign, and does the mail-in voting order make elections more or less fair in your view?